The school board president's face was a mask of disbelief. He kept looking from the official papers in his hands, to me, then back, to my mother Carol, a woman who wore her local power like a crown. His voice, when it finally came, was hesitant but firm, cutting through the tense silence of the auditorium. "Carol, the bylaws are clear," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "We have to read the speaker's submitted credentials into the public record." He took a slow, deliberate breath and swallowed hard. Her full credentials. My mother's smug expression began to curdle into confusion, a subtle tightening around her eyes that I knew all too well. She started to open her mouth, probably to dismiss the whole thing with a wave of her hand. But the president spoke again, his words dropping like stones into the quiet room. "And we have to recognize these are direct orders from the Pentagon." But 2 weeks earlier, that moment of reckoning felt impossibly distant. I was in a stuffy high school library for a PTA planning meeting, surrounded by well-meaning parents. As a career military officer on a rare shore duty assignment, I had offered my professional expertise to help structure a new JROTC program for my son's school. I was trying to explain the logistical benefits when my mother's voice sliced through the room. She was in her element, a board member holding court. "We appreciate my daughter's enthusiasm," she announced with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. She paused for effect, letting everyone turn to look at me. "But Eva's work is mostly administrative, a simple desk job. We need input from someone with real leadership experience." She gestured grandly towards a local business owner, who shifted uncomfortably. Then came the final, familiar twist of the knife, delivered with a syrupy dose of pity that was meant to sound like motherly concern. "She's always been a bit lazy, bless her heart. Never had the drive to make it to the top." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A cold fury, quiet and precise, began to build behind my ribs. It was the same tired accusation she'd leveled against me my entire life, her personal narrative for the daughter she couldn't understand or control. For a moment, I wasn't in that library. I was a teenager again, being told I wasn't ambitious enough, a young officer being told my career was a phase. But this time was different. This wasn't just about me. It was about my son and the future of a program he was passionate about. She chuckled, calling me lazy in a room where my unmentioned clearance level was higher than the entire school's operating budget. She had no idea she hadn't just insulted her daughter. She had dismissed a U.S. Navy commander in front of the very people whose approval I now needed. To understand the strategic takedown that followed, you have to understand the war I was fighting on two fronts. To my family, my life was a curiosity, a slightly embarrassing story they told at dinner parties. To the United States Navy, I was a strategic asset. I lived in these two separate worlds for nearly 2 decades, building a wall between them so solid I thought it was impenetrable. At home, I was a ghost at the table, a footnote in the grand story of my family's success. At work, my commands could shift the balance of power in a volatile region. The disconnect was jarring, and over the years it had carved out a hollow space inside. Of me, a place where their version of me lived, a lazy, aimless disappointment. I remember one Thanksgiving, the first one I'd made it home for in 2 years. I was bone-tired from a deployment that was 90% tension and 10% sheer terror. I was sitting at the familiar dining table, listening to the clink of silverware, and the loud, booming voice of my father, a man who valued appearances above all. He raised his glass to toast my younger sister, Janine, the family's golden child, a brilliant lawyer who had just been made junior partner. "Now that's a real career," he roared, beaming with a pride he never showed me. To Janine, building a real future. The whole family cheered, their faces glowing with admiration for her. Clear, understandable, and most importantly, profitable success. Later, I tried to share a small piece of my own life. I mentioned quietly that I had been awarded a commendation medal for strategic planning on my last tour, before I could even explain that the planning had prevented a major international incident. My mother patted my hand, her touch light and dismissive. "Oh, that's nice, honey. A little ribbon for your paperwork," she said, her eyes already scanning the room. "Did you hear Janine gets a corner office, with a view of the city?" In that moment, the medal in my mind, a symbol of sleepless nights, of impossible choices, of lives protected, shriveled into a meaningless trinket. That one pat on my hand was the culmination of 1,000 other dismissals. The unanswered emails about my promotions, the forgotten care packages, the years of my service reduced to a quirky hobby that kept me away from home. It was easier for them to file me away under a simple, condescending nickname they'd invented. Eva the admin, that's who I was to them. The government cog, the glorified secretary pushing papers in some forgotten corner of the world. It was a cruel little joke that allowed them to ignore the reality of what I did, because the reality was something they couldn't control, couldn't brag about at the country club. It was their shield against a truth they found inconvenient. A lazy daughter with a boring desk job was a story that made sense to them. A combat commander was not, but my other world was silent, cold, and deadly serious. I remember standing in a skiff, a sensitive, compartmented information facility, where the only light came from the glow of 24 monitors, and the only sound was the hum of servers and the low, controlled cadence of my team's voices. We were running a red team exercise, a war game simulating a catastrophic breach in naval intelligence. The pressure in that room was a physical force, a weight on your chest that never let up. Suddenly, the data streams went wild. It was a sophisticated phantom attack, designed to make us chase ghosts while the real threat slipped through. One of my best analysts called out a recommendation, a standard defensive maneuver. But something felt wrong. A flicker in the code, a pattern that was too perfect. No, I said, my voice cutting through the low murmur. That's a trap. All eyes turned to me. The weight of the entire carrier group, even in simulation, rested on my next command. Deny their ISR platform access. I want a full SIGINT blackout on the Eastern Corridor now. We run the Black Fog protocol. It was a risky, unconventional countermeasure. For a full 30 seconds, the only sound was the frantic clicking of keyboards. Then, a new symbol flared to life on the main screen. The simulated threat. Actor. Exposed and isolated. Exactly where my gut told me they would be. In the back of the room stood General Thompson, a grizzled but fair commanding officer who had been observing the exercise in total silence. He was a man of few words, and his praise was the rarest of currencies. He caught my eye from across the dark room and gave me a single, sharp nod. "Good instincts, Commander," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You just saved the entire carrier group." That nod, that one quiet acknowledgement of my competence from a man whose respect I had earned, felt more real and more valuable than any hollow toast my father had ever given. It was a confirmation that in this world, my world, I wasn't an admin. I was a commander. I tried to explain the disconnect to my father once, years ago. I cornered him in his study, away from my mother's suffocating presence, and tried to tell him how much her constant belittling hurt. He just sighed, polishing his glasses with a silk handkerchief. "You know your mother is a public figure in this town, Eva. Her image is everything," he'd said, not unkindly, but with a weary finality that crushed any hope of being understood. "Your unconventional career is hard for her to brag about. It's not like being a lawyer. Just let her have this. It's easier for everyone." It was easier for them to keep me in a box, to sand down the sharp, complicated edges of my life until I was smooth, simple, and ignorable. For years, I had compartmentalized. I was Eva the admin at home and Commander Rostova at work. But when my mother's political ambitions threatened my son's future, I decided to merge my two worlds. It was time for the school board to get a Pentagon-level briefing. Driving home from that PTA meeting, the hot, familiar sting of humiliation began to cool into something else entirely. It became a cold, hard resolve, the kind I only felt when a mission was in jeopardy. My mother's opposition wasn't personal anymore, it was tactical. She saw the JROTC program as a threat to her control, and my involvement as a blemish on her carefully curated public image. I realized then that another emotional confrontation would be a waste of resources. Arguing with her was like fighting a ghost. She would simply deny, deflect, and reframe my feelings as an overreaction. So I decided to stop playing her game. The objective was clear: ensure the JROTC program was approved. The obstacle was a single, powerful board member. My strategy would not be emotional. It would be procedural. That night, I didn't mourn the relationship I wished I had with my mother. Instead, I opened my laptop and began my reconnaissance. I approached the school district's public website like an enemy database, scanning for weaknesses. I spent hours poring over the mind-numbing text of their bylaws and public meeting regulations. And then I found it, a single clause, buried deep in the procedural code. Bylaw 74. It stated that any resident who registered to speak had the right to have their submitted credentials read into the public record. It was a rule designed for transparency, but I saw it for what it was, a weapon. The next morning, I initiated my plan. First, I made a formal request to the Department of the Navy's Public Affairs Office for a Declassified Service Abstract for Community Engagement. It was a standard document, dry and factual, but in this context, it would be devastating. It would list my rank, my current assignment, and my most notable service awards in the irrefutable black and white language of the federal government. Then, I completed the online form to speak at the next board meeting, submitting my name, simply as E. Rostova, a name that would be familiar but not alarming to my mother. Finally, I had the sealed official Navy documents couriered directly to the board president's office, along with a cover letter that explicitly referenced Bylaw 7.4. With the pieces in place, I made one last call. I dialed the number of the one person in my family who had always seen me for who I truly was, my grandfather, a retired Navy captain and a man who lived and breathed protocol. I explained the situation and the bylaw I had found. "Grandpa, am I reading this right?" I asked. "They have to read it aloud?" I heard him let out a low chuckle on the other end of the line. "Eva, it's Robert's Rules of Order. They're bound by their own procedure," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "They'll have no choice. It's time they learned who you are, Skipper." The submission was logged. The trap was set using their own rules. My mother saw my name on the agenda and smirked, thinking her lazy daughter was coming to beg. She had no idea I wasn't coming as her daughter. I was coming as a representative of the United States Armed Forces. When I walked into the high school auditorium that night, the air was thick with a mixture of cheap disinfectant and local politics. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost aggressive buzz, casting a pale, unflattering light on the rows of faces. I saw my mother, Carol, seated at the center of the long table on the stage, the main dais. She was in her kingdom, radiating an unshakable authority. She laughed at something the superintendent whispered to her, basking in the easy deference of the other board members, men and women who relied on her political influence. To them, she was a kingmaker. To me, she was an obstacle. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands weren't sweating. I felt a profound and chilling calm, the same focus I felt before a mission. This was just another engagement, with its own rules and its own objective. My mother finally tapped the microphone, the sharp sound echoing through the room. She scanned the crowd with a practiced political smile before her eyes landed on me. The smile tightened just a fraction. "And finally," she announced, her voice dripping with dismissive finality, "we'll now hear a final comment from a community member on the JROTC proposal before the board votes to table it indefinitely." She looked directly at me. "E. Rostova, you have 3 minutes." Every word was a carefully chosen weapon. Final comment, table indefinitely, E. Rostova. She was framing me as an insignificant afterthought, a powerless child making a last futile plea. I walked toward the podium, the sound of my sensible heels clicking deliberately on the polished floor. I could feel every eye in the room on me, could feel their pity, their curiosity, their indifference. I reached the podium and arranged my single sheet of paper, but before I could speak, a new voice cut in. It was the board president, a fussy, balding man named Mr. Abernathy who lived by the rigid comfort of rules and regulations. "One moment," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. He began shuffling through the papers in front of him, looking for my submission. He found it, and as his eyes scanned the page, his entire demeanor changed. His eyes widened. He looked up from the document, staring at me with a new, startled expression. He looked over at my mother, then back at me. "As per Bylaw 7.4, he began, his voice suddenly stripped of its usual bureaucratic monotone. "For the official record, I must read the speaker's credentials." He cleared his throat, a nervous, raspy sound. He was no longer just reading a formality. He was making an announcement. "Speaking on this matter is Commander Eva Rostova, United States Navy." A low murmur rippled through the auditorium. I saw heads turn, people whispering behind their hands. I kept my eyes on my mother. Her plastic smile was frozen in place, but a flicker of panic had ignited in her eyes. She was a politician. and she could sense the mood of a room turning against her. Mr. Abernathy's voice grew stronger, each word landing with more weight than the last. Commander Rostova is currently serving as, my God, Special Operations Command Liaison assigned to the Pentagon. The murmurs grew louder. This wasn't some local parent anymore. This was something else entirely. Her submitted file, he continued, now reading with a tone of outright awe, includes an 18-year service summary, 3 combat command tours. He paused, his eyes scanning the page in disbelief before he read the final, devastating detail. And the Navy Cross. A man in the front row, wearing a faded Marine's cap, let out an audible gasp. It wasn't a dramatic sound, but in the charged silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor in combat a person could receive. My mother's face, which had been pale, now seemed to drain of all color. The smug mask of the untouchable board member Carol Rostova didn't just crack, it shattered. I watched the woman who had called me lazy, who had called my life's work a desk job, confront a truth so far beyond her comprehension that she was rendered completely, utterly speechless. The room was dead silent. Every single person was staring at me. I calmly unfolded my own copy of the papers, the crisp sound echoing in the stillness. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke with the calm, clear authority of a commander addressing her unit. Board member Rostova, I began, making a point to use her title, severing the personal connection and establishing a professional one. You have publicly questioned my qualifications and stated that I am too lazy to succeed. I let those words hang in the air, a direct echo of her own public insults. These Pentagon orders state that my expertise in youth leadership development is considered a strategic asset to the Department of the Navy. I finally looked directly at her, locking her gaze for the first time. I am not here as your daughter. I am here as Commander Rostova. I paused, then delivered the final payload. And I am formally advising this board that the JROTC program is critical for national service recruitment and leadership. Tabling this vote would be a grave error. I finished speaking and simply stood there, my hands resting on the podium. The other board members were staring at my mother, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. The business owner she had so proudly championed was visibly sinking in his chair, trying to become invisible. Her power, built on whispers and favors and a carefully constructed image, had evaporated in less than 3 minutes. My entire life, my mother wielded her opinion as a weapon. In the end, it only took 1 page of official orders to silence her completely. As soon as I finished speaking, a heavy, profound silence blanketed the auditorium. It was broken by the board president, Mr. Abernathy, who cleared his throat and hastily called for a vote on the JROTC initiative. The motion to approve and fully fund the program was passed with a vote of 6-1. My mother was the lone nay. It was a petty, final act of defiance, the last gasp of a power that had been publicly dismantled. It didn't anger me. Instead, I felt a strange, detached pity. She had become a caricature of herself, isolated by her own pride while the rest of the board scrambled to align themselves with the new, undeniable authority in the room. When the meeting was adjourned, the room erupted into chatter. I saw my father take my mother's arm and guide her toward a side exit, there, movements quick and furtive, like shadows trying to escape the light. They didn't look at me. They didn't say a word. Their departure left a void that was immediately filled by something new, something I hadn't expected. A small group of parents approached me, their faces full of gratitude and respect. Then, the man from the front row, the one in the faded Marine's cap, made his way over. He stood before me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and simply extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, Commander," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I had never once heard from my own father. In that one handshake, in that simple, honest acknowledgement from a complete stranger, I felt a sense of belonging that my own family had denied me for 20 years. That night was the end of one war. The year that followed was about building the peace. 1 year later, I stood on that same high school auditorium stage, but this time, the lighting was warm and the room was filled not with tension but with applause. I was in my dress white uniform, the guest of honor at the first annual JROTC awards ceremony. My actions that night had sent ripples through the entire district. It led to the creation of a new policy, a veteran expertise protocol, designed to actively identify and utilize the skills of military-connected families. My personal victory had become a permanent institutional reform, a legacy that would help others long after I was gone. It was more than I had ever set out to do, and it was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The highlight of the evening was presenting the Cadet Leadership Award. As I called out the recipient's name, my son's name, he walked across the stage, his back straight, his own uniform perfectly pressed. He beamed at me as I pinned the medal to his chest, and in his eyes I saw more than just the love of a son for his mother. I saw a profound, unshakable respect. He saw me, all of me, not as Ava the admin or as some distant figure, but as his commander, his mentor, and his mom. It was a validation so pure and powerful it eclipsed a lifetime of feeling invisible. In the months that followed the board meeting, I found myself being pulled deeper into the school community. I became a mentor to the cadets, an advisor to the school on military family affairs. My new family became the cadre of instructors, the grateful parents, and the bright, hopeful faces of the kids whose lives I was now helping to shape. It was a community built not on dysfunctional obligation or a toxic hierarchy, but on a foundation of shared values and mutual earned respect. Here, my experience wasn't just acknowledged, it was sought after. Here, I wasn't a problem to be managed, I was an asset to be utilized. I had, after a lifetime of searching, finally found my tribe. During the awards ceremony, as my son was getting his picture taken with his friends, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text from my father. My breath caught for just a second, a ghost of an old habit before I read the words. Your mother saw the article about your GROTC program in the paper. She thinks it's a good thing for the community. I read the message twice. It wasn't an apology. It was never going to be an apology. It was a concession speech, a white flag sent from a distant, irrelevant shore. A year ago, that text might have given me a flicker of hope, a desperate desire to believe it was a new beginning. But now, I felt nothing. The vast, aching need for their approval had simply vanished, replaced by the quiet confidence of my new reality. I looked at the message one last time, then with a simple, deliberate tap of my thumb, I archived it without replying. The file was closed. The ledger was settled. I put my phone away and turned my attention back to the celebration, to the sound of laughter, to my son's proud smile, to the life I had built. My mother believed a legacy was about public perception and local power. I learned a true legacy is built in silence and validated by the lives you improve,